When dawn breaks over Sweden each Easter, something strange still happens in the frozen northern light. While frost clings to the ground and winter refuses to fully release its hold, small figures begin moving through the grey morning. Their faces are transformed, hidden beneath oversized scarves tied tight, wearing ragged dresses that drag in the mud, their cheeks marked with bright red circles that look disturbingly like bruises or the flush of sickness. In their hands, they clutch copper kettles and knock on doors, trading crude drawings for handfuls of candy. To anyone watching today, these tiny, costumed figures seem like nothing more than a quaint holdover from simpler times, as innocent as the decorated branches standing in every Swedish window. But this cheerful surface conceals a nightmare written in execution records and ash. What looks like children's play is actually the ghost of something unspeakable, a memory of the decade when Sweden tore itself apart in a frenzy of accusations, beheadings, and burnings. Hundreds died in the flames. At the center of this horror was a belief in a supernatural realm called Blåkulla, a place where reality itself inverted. What we're about to uncover is the true terror behind those painted smiles, the story of the executioner's blade and the ancient frozen presence known as the Blue Maiden. Imagine yourself as a seaman in the year 1600, your palms torn and stinging from handling the icy, salt-encrusted rigging as your vessel cuts through the Kalmar Strait. The wind carries a sound like a distant wail, and the Baltic stretches out like an endless black mirror. Then, emerging from the fog, like the back of some ancient sleeping beast, a massive granite dome rises into view. Your chest tightens. You look away instinctively. You know that speaking the name Blåkulla anywhere near these waters is an invitation to catastrophe, a guarantee that the sea will rise up and drag your ship to the bottom. So instead, you whisper a different name, the Blue Maiden. It's a verbal shield, a careful way of acknowledging what's there without giving it power. You steer your course as far from that stone shore as navigation permits, because you understand that this is more than just an island. It's a doorway. It's the physical foundation for a landscape of the cursed, a place where the human world ends and the realm of darkness begins. The geological facts tell a different story, though one equally unsettling. Blåjungfrun rises 86 meters from the churning Baltic, a fortress of strange blue-grey granite that seems wrong somehow, foreign to the gentle, rolling Swedish coastline. No fresh water flows there, nothing lives there but the wind. While the mainland prepares for spring's arrival, the island remains a harsh, unchanging monument to desolation. It exists as the perfect threshold, a place where the barrier between our reality and something unknowable has worn dangerously thin. It is isolation made physical. Throughout the 17th century, this island became the focus of a national nightmare. People believed it existed in two places at once, both in the physical world and in a spectral dimension, a destination only accessible to those who had surrendered their souls in exchange for the power of flight. The old records didn't treat this as symbolic. Olaus Magnus, Sweden's last Catholic archbishop, wrote in 1555 of a terrible and merciless place where every witch was forced to gather on Maundy Thursday. He described the journey not as allegory, but as actual travel across a sea that hungered for human souls. In the popular imagination of that era, Blåkulla shifted shape, sometimes a floating meadow, sometimes an underwater kingdom. But the sight of the actual island in the strait gave weight to these fears. It was something you could see from shore, a permanent looming presence that suggested the devil wasn't some distant concept, but a close neighbor who lived just beyond the horizon. Recent archaeological work has shown that the island's reputation for otherworldliness extends far back before Christian demonology. In 2014, researchers uncovered evidence of ritual activity stretching back 9,000 years. Deep within the granite, they found proof of Mesolithic presence, suggesting the Blue Maiden has been a site of mysterious worship since humans first arrived in the north. They identified two major ritual locations that challenge our assumptions about the ancient world. First, the altar cave, a deep natural split in the granite that served as an offering site to gods whose names we've forgotten, long before Christianity reached these shores. Second, the theater cave, a vast hollow with natural stone tiers, suggesting gatherings or ritual performances, whose purpose remains unknown. These caves were never living spaces. They were sanctuaries for the dead, used by ancient peoples to reach toward the cold powers of earth and sea. The 17th century terror surrounding Blåkulla wasn't invented by the church. It was a lingering echo of a pre-Christian recognition that this place has always felt separate from the world of the living. This sense of separation is strongest on the southern shore, where the Trojaborg labyrinth sits. This stone maze of uncertain origin remains the center of a powerful modern superstition. According to folklore, the labyrinth is a trap for supernatural forces designed to prevent the island's spectral energy from following visitors back to the mainland. The cardinal rule, never take a stone from the island's surface. To take even a pebble from the Blue Maiden is to take a piece of its curse. The stones are believed to be bound to the island's dark energy, and any souvenir will bring relentless misfortune until it's returned. This isn't merely superstition handed down through generations. It's a documented modern reality. Every year, local authorities receive packages containing returned granite, often with desperate letters from tourists describing financial collapse, unexplained illnesses, and bizarre accidents that began the moment they brought a stone home. In 2004, the situation reached such proportions that over 160 stones were publicly returned to the island by ferry in a formal ceremony meant to lift the perceived curses. The Blue Maiden doesn't just hold its stones. It holds the consciousness of those who visit, forcing them into a ritual of return that mirrors the ancient cycles of the witches' gathering. During the 16th and 17th centuries, this landscape became the foundation for a nationwide panic. The island was understood as a stronghold of the inverted realm, a place where God's laws and nature's order were suspended. On Maundy Thursday, when the church's protection was thought to be weakest, the air above the strait was believed to fill with the rhythmic sound of beating wings, as those who had rejected their faith took to the sky. The sight of the island through the spring fog created profound spiritual dread, the visible portion of an invisible iceberg of demonic presence. The island's physical isolation made it the perfect container for the social and religious anxieties of a nation drained by war and starvation. In Sweden's isolated communities, where the minister's word was absolute law and fear of the unknown was a constant companion, the Blue Maiden became the forbidden place. And this psychological projection transformed a geological landmark into a stage for the occult. Excavations have revealed evidence of animal sacrifices and the intentional burning of wood species that don't grow on the island, proving that for thousands of years, people braved this waterless, dangerous rock specifically to perform acts of high ritual. When the children of the Great Noise began testifying about their journeys to the Blue Hill, they were drawing from a deep, ancient well of cultural memory that had been sustained by these stones for 9 millennia. The legend eventually transformed from sailors' superstition into a detailed blueprint of hell on earth. The island was no longer just rock. It became a demonic castle, complete with banquet halls and stables for supernatural mounts. This transition from ancient ritual site to legal evidence represents one of the most significant transformations in European history, the moment when the mystical was weaponized by the state. The National Witchcraft Commission used Blåkulla's geography as a framework for interrogations, treating the island as a legal reality as concrete as any town on a map. By the time the panic reached its height, the Blue Maiden was no longer a place of stone and sea. It was a place of testimony and flame. This geography of damnation created a trap for the innocent. If you lived within sight of the island lived within you. The spectral journey to the gathering was understood as an act of betrayal against both crown and God. The Blue Maiden sat in the strait like a silent witness, its blue granite heights observing the hysteria that would soon devastate entire parishes. The naming prohibition practiced by sailors was a futile attempt to keep danger at arm's length, but as the 17th century advanced, that danger refused to stay on the rock. It followed the stories and the forbidden names back to the mainland, where the first sparks of the great noise were waiting to ignite. To avoid speaking a name is to acknowledge its power. By refusing to say Blokula, sailors were admitting that the island was an active, malevolent force in their lives. The granite wasn't just geology, it was a living presence with hostile intent. When the trials began, this belief provided fertile ground for hysteria to take root. Eventually, the legend of the Blue Maiden became a story about children. The 17th century trials were unique because they didn't depend on confessions from social outcasts, but on the terrifying accounts told by the community's youth. These children claimed the island was an inverted paradise where they were fed at the devil's table, describing the flight over the sea with such vivid sensory detail that the courts accepted it as truth. The physical presence of the island served as the ultimate piece of corroborating evidence. If the island existed, then the horror must be real. Analysis of these testimonies reveals a tragic cycle between adult anxiety and childhood imagination. Children were questioned in sessions called angel chambers, where they were encouraged to reveal the secrets of the Blue Hill. Sensing the adults' desperate hunger for specific answers, they provided increasingly elaborate details, transforming the silent granite into a nightmare of blood rituals and demonic banquets. It's a place where fresh water cannot be found, yet 9,000 years of humanity found reasons to go there. It's a place where the granite turns blue in twilight, reflecting colors from the underworld. It's a place where a stone labyrinth sits in silence, collecting curses from those who dare disturb it. The Blue Maiden sits in the Kalmar Strait as proof that the geography of damnation isn't just a mental construct, but a map of the earth itself. The great noise may have quieted, but the island that anchored it remains, cold and blue, and waiting for the next Maundy Thursday. The records of the Torsaka massacre demonstrate how quickly a landmark can transform into a scaffold. When 71 people were led to Witch Mountain to be beheaded and burned, they were being executed for a journey to a place visible from their homes. The tragedy was that it turned the horizon into a crime scene. As we move deeper into the rituals of the gathering and the blood of the 17th century, remember the sailor in the mist, refusing to speak the name. He understood something we've forgotten, that certain places shouldn't be visited and certain names shouldn't be spoken. The story of Blokula shows how we project our deepest terrors onto the landscape around us, and how sometimes that landscape projects those terrors back. The island remains a silent guardian, where the ancient and modern, the mystical and the horrifying, converge in the blue light of the Baltic. It's the beginning of our descent into the great noise, the shadow that hangs over every red-painted cheek on an Easter morning. For the children of the 17th century, the flight to the Blue Hill was a matter of survival or death. For the children of today, it's entertainment. But the island doesn't recognize the difference. It only recognizes the ritual, the stones, and the long, cold silence of the sea. The curse of the Blue Maiden is a living connection between the ancient ritualists and our modern digital age. It's a reminder that some boundaries are eternal, and some landscapes are forever haunted by the names we're too frightened to speak. The geography of damnation isn't behind us. It's still there, rising from the mist, waiting for the gathering to begin again. But geography is only the stage. To understand how a nation descended into madness, we must examine more closely the instruments of the craft, the secret ointments, the inverted prayers, and the object every Swedish child still carries today without knowing its true, malevolent purpose. The bedroom air is heavy with the smell of animal fat and unwashed fabric. It's Maundy Thursday, the night the world pauses, the night the church's protection is traditionally thought to crack open at the memory of betrayal in a garden. A woman crouches by the fireplace, her movements quick and anxious. She reaches into a concealed crack in the stonework and pulls out a small, darkened horn, the medicine horn. Inside is a thick grey paste that smells of spoiled fat and something metallic, like aged blood. With shaking hands, she smears the handle of a birch rake and the bottoms of her bare feet. She speaks a prayer, but the words are broken, spiraling backward into the throat of darkness. Suddenly, the chimney seems to expand, the soot becoming a passage to the stars. She mounts the rake, and with a rhythmic, nauseating sound of invisible wings, she's pulled upward. The thatched roof disappears, replaced by the cold, cutting wind of the upper atmosphere. Below, the village lights vanish, and ahead, across the churning black emptiness of the sea, the blue hill begins to shine with an unholy, spectral glow. The journey has begun. In the 17th century, this flight wasn't understood as a mental breakdown or a hunger-induced hallucination. To the Swedish legal system, it was a physical and spiritual crossing of the boundary between the human world and the chaotic outer realm. Central to every trial during the Great Noise was the description of the ointment and the vehicle of transport. These weren't just narratives, they were forensic evidence. The medicine horn appeared in hundreds of testimonies as a primary marker of a witch. If a search of a woman's home uncovered a horn containing unidentified grease, it was often presented in court as conclusive proof. The origins of this flying ointment were described in terms that still have the power to disturb. During the trials, child witnesses, often under heavy pressure from the angel chambers, testified that the grease was manufactured at the gathering itself. They spoke of massive iron kettles where the bodies of unbaptized infants or changeling children were rendered down until only the essence of their innocence remained. Other accounts claimed the ointment was made from stolen church bell metal, ground to powder, and mixed with the fat of executed criminals. Once the implements were anointed, any object could become a vehicle for flight. A broomstick, a rake, a wooden beam, even a neighbor's cow, ridden so violently through the sky that the animal would be found the next morning in its stall, soaked in sweat and shaking with trauma. These descriptions are the distorted remnants of much older shamanic practices. In the pre-Christian North, the female prophet, known as the vulva, used a spirit staff to enter altered states of consciousness. This staff was a symbolic vehicle for the soul's journey. When 17th century church investigators heard children describe women flying on poles, they were hearing a demonic reinterpretation of a shamanic ritual that had existed in Scandinavia for thousands of years. The flight wasn't a physical movement of the body, but a projection of consciousness. Yet in the legal frenzy of the 1670s, the distinction between the spiritual and physical was completely obliterated. Upon reaching the Blue Hill, the initiates weren't greeted by a monster, but by a figure of disturbing and worldly appeal. The Swedish devil of the 1600s was rarely the horned, red-skinned creature of southern European imagery. Instead, he was often described as a man of high social standing, frequently called the Little Master. He wore expensive, colorful clothing, often blue and black, with silver buckles on his shoes and a hat that permanently shadowed his face. He was a figure of prosperity in a time of famine, a figure of authority in a time of social breakdown. He stood at the gates of Blåkulla with a massive ledger, waiting for the initiates to erase their names from God's book and sign themselves into his service with their own blood. This imagery reveals the profound social tension of the era. The devil wasn't a distant myth. He was a reflection of the local aristocracy and the emerging merchant class. To the struggling peasants of Dalarna and Torsaka, The greatest temptation wasn't hellfire and eternal torment. It was fine clothing, sufficient food, and a sense of belonging in a world that felt increasingly hostile. The gathering was framed as an inverted reality where the social and religious hierarchy was completely reversed. It was a space where the marginalized could imagine themselves as powerful, and the powerless could imagine themselves as part of a secret, dark elite. Inside the halls of Blocula, the law of inversion governed every action. The gathering was a dark mockery of Christian worship. The participants didn't sit facing forward. They sat with their backs to the table. They didn't dance in circles facing inward. They danced back to back, their heels striking in rhythmic, discordant patterns. When they prayed, they recited the Lord's Prayer backward, a linguistic ritual meant to unravel the fabric of creation. The devil himself would stand at a makeshift altar, delivering sermons that ridiculed the local ministers, baptizing children not in water, but in a thick, dark liquid that smelled of iron and earth. The feast at the gathering was the ultimate inversion of Holy Communion. Child witnesses, pressured to describe the wickedness they'd witnessed, spoke of a banquet that was both extravagant and disgusting. They described silver platters heaped with troll butter, a yellow slime we now recognize as a common woodland fungus, but which they believed to be the excrement of witches' familiars. They spoke of consuming toads and serpents, and bread made from sawdust and ground bone. This banquet served a specific legal function. It proved that the accused had physically participated in the devil's hospitality, making their betrayal of Christ absolute. The descriptions of the food at Blocula often reflected the actual diet of starving Swedish peasants during the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. When children described eating bread that crumbled to ash in their mouths, they were describing the reality of bark bread and famine foods they were forced to consume at home. The gathering was a nightmare realm constructed from the materials of their everyday suffering, a place where even abundance was just another form of torture. One of the most persistent and eerie elements of the gathering ritual was the creation of the biera, or milk hare. The biera was a magical servant, a construct fashioned from yarn and hair and a few drops of the witch's own blood. Once animated by a demonic incantation, the biera would run to neighboring farms and drain the milk from cows, returning to regurgitate the stolen bounty into the witch's churn. In the folklore, discovering a biera was to find physical proof of a pact. They were described as hopping, limping creatures that moved with unnatural speed, their eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. In the courtroom, the biera was a powerful weapon for the prosecution. Any sudden decrease in a neighbor's milk production or mysterious livestock illness could be blamed on a milk hare dispatched from a nearby household. This created an atmosphere of paranoid surveillance. Every shadow in the barn, every strange cluster of yarn found in a corner, became a potential demonic agent. The mystical had become a weapon of neighbor against neighbor. The ritual of the gathering provided a complete framework for explaining all the misfortunes of rural existence, transforming crop failure into cosmic warfare. As the night of the gathering drew toward conclusion, the little master would reward his followers with gifts as illusory as the feast. He would give them coins that transformed into dried leaves by morning, or jewels that were nothing more than polished pebbles. The return flight was a desperate race against sunrise. If a witch wasn't back in her bed before the first rooster's crow, the spell would shatter and she would plummet from the sky like a stone. The folklore is filled with accounts of women found dead in the fields on Good Friday morning, their bodies shattered as if they'd fallen from tremendous height, their skin still carrying the sulphurous scent of Blocula's winds. These fall stories likely served as a warning to those who might be tempted by the freedom of the gathering. The ritual was a trap. You could fly, you could feast, you could dance, but the cost was your soul and ultimately your life. The 17th century authorities used these stories to demonstrate the devil's unreliability. He was a deceiver who gave stones instead of sustenance. By emphasizing the inverted and fraudulent nature of the gathering, church and state reinforced the concept that the only security lay in absolute submission to the Lutheran monarchy. The ritual was also an instrument of social control. By defining the gathering as a place where women assumed men's roles and children were treated as adults, the authorities were highlighting what they perceived as the dangerous collapse of patriarchal order. The fear of Blåkulla was, fundamentally, a fear of a world where traditional hierarchy had disintegrated. The great noise was the sound of that hierarchy attempting to reassert itself through the blood of the accused. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the gathering ritual was the mark. It was believed that the devil would brand his followers with a hidden sign, a spot on the skin that felt no pain and wouldn't bleed when pierced. This mark, sometimes called the devil's fingerprint, was the ultimate proof of ownership. During the trials, specialized witch prickers were hired to strip the accused and examine every inch of their bodies for these signs. A birthmark, a scar, even a patch of calloused skin could become a death warrant. The water ordeal and the pricking of the mark were the physical manifestations of the gathering ritual in the material world. They were the methods used to drag the spectral into the tangible. If a woman was believed to have flown to Blåkulla, her body was no longer her own. It became a map of her crimes. The inversion of the gathering was met with the invasion of the law. The privacy of the home and the integrity of the body were stripped away in the name of protecting the community from the Blue Hill. Today, we see the remnants of these rituals everywhere, though we choose to interpret them as charming rather than sinister. We carry containers that echo the medicine horn, and we decorate our homes with the very birch branches that were once thought to be greased with the rendered fat of the dead. But the great noise has been silenced, and the flight to Blåkulla is no longer a physical journey. It remains a cultural one, a folklore survival that connects modern suburbs to the iron-grey winds of the 17th century Baltic. The flight to the Blue Hill was a promise of escape. In a world of cold and hunger, the concept of a secret meadow where you could dance with the master was a powerful narcotic. But as the sun rose on Good Friday, the promise always dissolved, leaving nothing but the smell of smoke and the sound of the executioner's bell. The ritual was a cycle of hope and horror, a spectral trap that was about to spring on a massive scale as the hysteria moved from the folklore of the bedroom into the reality of the village square. The rules of the gathering allowed a society to systematically annihilate its own members. By defining the enemy with such vivid, ritualistic detail, the authorities made the invisible threat of witchcraft visible. They transformed the liminal into the literal, and in doing so, prepared the way for the bloodiest chapter in Swedish history. The flight to Blåkulla was about to end in the fires of Torsåker. The great noise was about to become a scream. In the high summer of 1668, the air in the remote valley of Älvdalen hung thick with the scent of pine and the heavy, humid threat of a coming storm. A 12-year-old shepherd girl named Gertrude Svensdotter stood by the banks of the Dalälven River, tending her father's sheep. The quiet was broken by a whisper from another child, a boy who claimed he witnessed Gertrude doing something impossible. He watched as she walked across the water's surface, her feet barely touching the ripples as she guided her flock to greener pasture on the opposite bank. It was a flicker of childhood fantasy, perhaps an optical trick of the shifting mountain light, but in the fragile atmosphere of 17th century Sweden, it was a match dropped onto kindling. The whisper began to expand. It became a low, insistent hum that vibrated through the floorboards of every dwelling in the valley. It was the birth of a sound that history would call Det stora avasändet, the great noise. This wasn't a single eruption of violence, but a slow, methodical slide into collective insanity. The centre was the parish of Älvdalen in the province of Dalarna. The local minister, Lars Elvius, was a man of rigid, inflexible faith who perceived the hand of evil in every shadow. When the rumours about Gertrude reached him, he didn't see children's play. He saw a rupture in the spiritual defence of his community. He brought Gertrude into the cold, dim space of the church, and under the crushing pressure of his interrogation, the girl's story began to shift. She confessed that she hadn't walked on water through her own ability. She claimed she'd been taught dark arts by a neighbour's servant, a woman known as Big Meret. The story of Big Meret provides a disturbing glimpse at how reputation could become execution. She was a woman who existed on the edges, a servant who didn't conform to the strict model of the perfect Lutheran subject. Gertrude's testimony against her was vivid and detailed. She claimed that Meret had led her into the barn on a moonless night, smeared a calf with a shimmering grey ointment, and together they had mounted the animal and flown through the air, straight through the chimney and across the mountain peaks to the Blue Hill. This was the first time the ritual of the gathering was formally entered into Swedish court documentation. It was the moment spectral flight became legal reality. Meret maintained her innocence with an intensity that disturbed her accusers. Even when confronted with the tearful testimony of a child she'd once befriended, she refused to provide the confession the court desperately wanted. But in the climate of 1668, silence wasn't interpreted as innocence. It was seen as ultimate proof of a hardened soul. The court found her guilty, not based on physical evidence, but on the perceived spiritual authenticity of her accuser. Her execution on May 19, 1669, was the first tolling of a bell that would soon ring throughout the entire kingdom. The panic spread like a virulent infection, following the trade routes and travellers' whispers. From Älvdalen, the hysteria moved to the neighbouring parish of Mora. By the summer of 1669, the great noise had reached a deafening pitch. In a single mass execution in Mora, 17 people were led to the pyre while 60 more remained in chains, awaiting their fate. The fear was no longer about a single woman in a barn. It was about an invisible army of the night, stealing Sweden's children while they slept. Every household became a fortress, every neighbour a potential informant. The chronology of the panic reveals a terrifying geographical progression. In the years that followed, the frenzy moved steadily northward into the province of Härjedalen. In the small village of Lillhärdal, 30 more people were executed for the crime of kidnapping children. Initially, the Swedish crown had required a confession or multiple adult witnesses for a death sentence, but as the great noise intensified, the authorities in Stockholm felt pressure to respond. They established a National Witchcraft Commission, a mobile court of judges and theologians charged with purging the land of the demonic. By 1674, the standards of proof had been reduced to a level that made defence impossible. The commission officially sanctioned the use of torture to extract confessions, and the consistent testimony of children was now deemed sufficient for execution. The law had essentially abandoned the adult world and handed the instruments of justice to the very young. This was the birth of the angel chambers, sessions where groups of children were assembled in the presence of authority and encouraged to speak their nightmares aloud. The more elaborate and horrific their accounts, the more they were celebrated as channels of truth. In the year 1675, the Great Noise found its most passionate architect in Laurentius Horneus, the assistant minister of Torsaker parish. Horneus believed the end times were imminent, and that the devil had made Torsaker his primary fortress. He employed 2 teenage boys, known as the Nordingro boys or the Seeing Boys, who claimed they possessed spectral vision. They told the terrified parishioners that they could see the devil's mark on the foreheads of the witches, a sign invisible to normal eyes, proving the person had attended the gathering at Blåkulla. Imagine the scene at Torsaker Church on a Sunday morning. The congregation stands in the cold, thin light of the sanctuary, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. At the entrance stand, the Nordingro boys, their eyes scanning the faces of their elders. With a single trembling finger, a boy points to a mother of 4, then to a grandmother, then to a young girl barely older than himself. In that instant, the social fabric of the parish is torn to shreds. The boys were compensated by the parish for their services, a detail that adds a layer of cold, calculated profit to the spiritual frenzy. Any personal grudge or social peculiarity was now potential evidence of the devil. The interrogations in Torsåker reached a level of psychological brutality that defies comprehension. Horneus and his colleagues didn't just employ the lash and the water ordeal. They exploited the most fundamental fears of their victims. They allegedly threatened to roast the children of the accused in massive stone ovens if the mothers refused to confess to taking them to the Blue Hill. Confronted with the image of their children's agonizing deaths, many women collapsed. They provided the court with precisely the narratives the ritual required, accounts of flight and demonic contracts, just to protect their families from the flames. They were confessing to fantasies to escape a reality that had become far more terrifying than any nightmare. The climax of this local insanity occurred on June 1st, 1675. It was a day of carnage that would leave the parish devastated. After a final sermon in the church, 71 people, 65 women, 2 men, and 4 boys, were led in a long, silent procession to Hexberget, Witch Mountain. Some of the condemned were so shattered by months of torture and imprisonment that they had to be carried by their own family members to the execution site. They were beheaded in full view of their neighbors and surviving relatives, and their bodies were thrown onto the pyres. This single event eliminated approximately 20% of the female population of the region. The great noise had become a physical burden, a literal mountain of ash. The names of the dead at Torsåker read like a census of a dying community. There was Merit in Ness, a 60-year-old mother accused of creating a familiar from her own blood. There was Halt Karin, a disabled servant whose physical disability was presented as evidence of a curse. There was Ella in Norum, who was executed alongside her 2 young sons. These were the familiar faces of the village, transformed into spectral enemies by the power of rumor and the zeal of a fanatic. The executions were technically unlawful, yet in the frenzy of 1675, the law was whatever the man with the Bible declared it to be. The hysteria eventually reached the heart of the kingdom, the capital city of Stockholm. It was carried there by a young man named Johan Johansson, known as the Gavel Boy, who accused his own mother of witchcraft. In the capital, the trials claimed the life of Malin Matsdotter, a woman of such iron resolve that she refused to confess even under threat of death. She was the only woman in the Swedish trials to be burned alive, without the mercy of being beheaded first. Her silent defiance before the flames was a stark contrast to the screaming children who had condemned her there. But the death of Malin Matsdotter marked the beginning of the end. Shortly after her execution, cracks in the great noise began to appear. A young child witness confessed to a member of the Witchcraft Commission that he'd fabricated everything. He admitted that the stories of the Blue Hill were fantasies he and the other children had shared to gain status and attention. This admission triggered a cascade of retractions. Child after child confessed that they had never encountered the devil and had never flown through chimneys. The collapse of the great noise was as rapid as its ascent. The legal system began arresting child accusers for perjury. The very children who had been celebrated as vessels of divine truth were now led to the gallows themselves. The great noise ended not with religious awakening, but with a grim realization that the kingdom had allowed itself to be led to slaughter by the imagination of its youth. By 1676, the pyres were extinguished, but the silence that followed was even more haunting than the noise. Easter today is a season of light and sweets. But we must remember it was once a season of paranoid surveillance. Every charming tradition of the modern holiday is a folklore survival of this period of bloodshed. The birch branches were once instruments of flagellation. The red-painted cheeks of children are a mask covering the faces of the accusers who once wielded the power of life and death. The great noise has faded to a whisper, but it serves as a warning of what occurs when we allow our fears to transform our neighbors into monsters. Witch Mountain in Torsorka still stands, a silent monument to the 71 souls consumed by the hysteria. The wind that moves through the pines there still carries the echo of the great noise. It's a reminder that the boundary between order and chaos is thinner than we prefer to believe. As we move closer to the mystical roots of the gathering and the shamanic origins of the flight, keep your attention on the children. For in the 17th century, the children were the eyes of the law, and what they witnessed was a world that deserved to burn. The room is cramped and freezing, lit only by a single flickering candle that throws long, jerking shadows against the whitewashed walls. At the center sits a child, perhaps no older than 6 or 7, her feet hovering inches above the floor. She's surrounded by men dressed in black, ministers and magistrates and scribes, their eyes weighted with desperate, hungry anticipation. They don't ask if she was abducted in the night. They ask what the devil fed her at the Blue Hill. They ask if her mother greased the broomstick with the fat of a neighbor's infant. The silence in the room is a heavy, oppressive presence, pressing down on the child until the line between what she dreamed and what she must declare begins to blur. She notices the approval in their eyes when she mentions iron combs and blood. She realizes her words carry a weight that can shift mountains and build pyres. And so, with a voice that is small and spectral, she begins to construct a nightmare that will devour her own family. The most disturbing aspect of the great noise was the role assumed by the very young. Unlike witch trials elsewhere in Europe, or the notorious events in Salem, where accusers were often adolescent girls, the Swedish hysteria depended almost entirely on the testimonies of children. In the courtrooms of the 1670s, witnesses as young as 5 were brought forward to testify against their parents and grandparents. These children were simultaneously the primary accusers and the perceived victims of the gathering, a dual role that created a psychological trap of unimaginable cruelty. They were the eyes of the law in a world that had gone blind with terror. To extract these testimonies, church and state employed sessions known as angel chambers. These weren't interrogations as we might understand them today. They were sessions of guided imagination and intense pressure. Village children were gathered together and encouraged to reveal the secrets of their nocturnal abductions. In these rooms, a child who stayed silent was often treated with suspicion or threatened with punishment, while a child who provided the most vivid and horrific details was rewarded with recognition and praise. This created social contagion. Sensing the adults' desperate hunger for a particular kind of truth, the children began competing with one another to supply more elaborate and terrifying accounts. The truth of the gathering was collaborative fiction. They described being transformed into ravens and flying over rooftops. They spoke of witnessing their mothers milk the devil's fingers to produce a black, bitter liquid. They told stories of neighbors being combed with iron brushes that stripped the skin from their bodies in long, bloody ribbons. These weren't the narratives of children who had witnessed evil. These were the narratives of children who had learned that horror was the only currency that purchased safety. The descriptions provided by these young witnesses were a chaotic blend of Lutheran demonology and distorted local folklore. They spoke of the little master and his elegant blue garments, of the reversed prayers, and of the banquet of toads and troll butter. But they also included details that revealed the underlying trauma of their own lives. They spoke of the devil's mark and the medicine horn with such sensory precision that the judges found it impossible to believe they were fabricating. The authorities failed to understand that the children were simply reflecting the fears adults had been whispering in their presence for years. The psychological dynamic created a horrific, inescapable dilemma for the children. While they were considered kidnapped and therefore victims, their participation in the gathering was viewed as a spiritual crime requiring ritual purification. In the town of Mora, 148 children were sentenced to run the gauntlet or be whipped by their own parents before the church doors. This was the ultimate inversion of the parental bond. A child was forced to denounce their mother to avoid the whipping post, only to watch that same mother be led to the pyre as a direct consequence of their words. As the great noise entered its most frantic phase, the role of children became increasingly institutionalized. Figures like the Gävleborg in Stockholm or the Nordingrå boys in Torsåker were essentially professional accusers. They were compensated by parishes to identify the marked among the congregation. They stood at church entrances like spectral gatekeepers, their presence a constant menace. These boys possessed social power no child should ever hold, the power to determine who lived and who burned. They were the celebrities of the panic, their every utterance recorded and analyzed as if it were holy writ. The witnesses of the void also described a version of Blåkulla that was strangely domestic. They spoke of the devil's children and the marriages that occurred at the gathering. This suggests the children were projecting their own social structures onto the supernatural realm. The gathering was a dark reflection of the village itself, a place where hierarchies were inverted, but the faces remained familiar. This made the testimonies even more convincing to judges. If children described the gathering as a place with a kitchen, a stable, and a nursery, it felt grounded and authentic. The brutality of the executions was often preceded by a final confrontation between child and accused. In many cases, mothers would beg their children to recant, to speak truth and save their lives. But the children, trapped by their own narratives and the watchful eyes of the ministers, almost never relented. To recant was to admit to lying, and in the 17th century, a false witness was often treated with the same severity as a witch. The children were as much prisoners of the great noise as the women in chains. They were riding a wave of hysteria they could no longer control. The collapse of the great noise in 1676 was triggered by the very thing that had sustained it, the words of a child. In Stockholm, after the iron-willed Malin Matsdotter had been consumed by flames, the cracks in the collective delusion finally began to widen. A young boy who had been a key witness confessed that he had never been to the Blue Hill. He admitted the stories were a game, a method of gaining importance in a world that usually ignored him. This single confession acted like a stone hurled into a mirror, shattering the consensus. The aftermath for child witnesses was as grim as the trials themselves. Once legal authorities realized they'd been misled by the fantasies of the young, their response was swift and ruthless. Several of the primary child accusers were arrested for perjury and sentenced to death. The great noise ended with a final round of executions, but this time it was the accusers who were led to the gallows. The kingdom was attempting to cleanse the blood from its hands by sacrificing the children it had previously corrupted. This period of history confronts us with a haunting question about the nature of memory and truth. The children of the 1670s were products of a society that had lost its bearings. When we observe modern Swedish Easter and see children in their headscarves and painted cheeks, we're witnessing the sanitized ghosts of these child accusers. We've transformed the witnesses of the void into symbols of spring and innocence, effectively burying the trauma of the angel chambers beneath a mountain of candy and colorful feathers. We allow our children to dress as the very figures that once sent their ancestors to the stake, perhaps as a way to tame the memory. But for the historian, the charming tradition is a chilling reminder of a time when a child's imagination was a lethal weapon. The painted red cheeks of today are echoes of the feverish flush witnessed in the courtrooms 300 years ago. The great noise was the sound of a generation of children crying for attention in a world that only listened when they spoke of the devil. It was a failure of the adult world to protect the young from the malevolent power of their own fears. As we prepare for another Easter, we must look beyond the masks and the copper kettles and remember the children of Torsaka and Mora. They were the primary victims of the gathering myth, forced to sacrifice their humanity and their families to satisfy the spiritual appetites of a society in the grip of frenzy. The flight to Blokula was a journey that began in the eyes of a child. It was a journey into a world where truth was whatever the powerful wanted it to be. The silence that followed the great noise was the silence of a generation that had witnessed too much and spoken too much. A generation that had been forced to gaze into the void and call it by its name. But what were they actually witnessing? Was it pure fantasy, or were they accessing something much older than the church? To discover the answer, we must descend beneath the pyres and into the blue shadows of the ancient north. Close your eyes and travel backward through the centuries, past church steeples and smoking pyres, until the sound of bells is replaced by the rhythmic pounding of a drum. The air here isn't thick with the smell of the stake, but with the sharp scent of crushed juniper and the heavy musk of animal hides. A figure sits by a fire that has burned for 10,000 years. She is the vulva, the prophet of the old world, and she holds a staff of iron and wood known as the gander. As she chants, her eyes roll back, revealing only white emptiness. She isn't falling asleep. She's preparing to depart. With a sudden, violent spasm, her spirit is torn from her flesh, pulled upward into the freezing celestial winds. She's no longer a woman of the village. She's a traveler of the hidden pathways. She flies not to a demonic banquet, but to the roots of the world tree, her soul navigating the spaces between stars. This is the oldest flight in the north, a journey that began long before the word witch was ever whispered in a courtroom. To the modern consciousness, the stories of Blokula seem like nothing more than frantic fictions of a persecuted people. But the historian of the mystical sees something far more ancient lurking beneath the surface of the trials. The concept of the soul journey to a hidden mountain didn't originate with the 17th century church. It was a deeply embedded ancestral cultural memory, a distorted echo of pre-Christian Scandinavian and Siamese shamanism. The flight to the Blue Hill wasn't an invention of the Great Noise. It was the reclassification of a ritual practiced in dark forests and frozen tundras for millennia. In Old Norse culture, the practice of cedar was a form of ecstatic magic, performed primarily by female practitioners. Cedar involved the projection of consciousness, a state where the practitioner's awareness would detach from the physical body to travel through the spirit realm. This out-of-body travel is the direct ancestor of the witch's flight. The tools of the ancient vulva mirror the tools of the accused with chilling precision. The vulva carried her gander, a staff or spirit wand that was linguistically and symbolically connected to the spirit helper. When investigators heard children describe women flying on poles and rakes, they were hearing a Christianized, malevolent interpretation of the shamanic staff, the original vehicle for the astral journey. The influence of the indigenous Sami people also haunts the legend of Blokula. The Sami Noaidi, or shaman, employed a drum to enter deep trance states, during which their soul would ascend the world tree or descend into the underworld to communicate with the dead. Scholars have observed that the very topography of the gathering, the journey across a vast, churning sea to a mountain at the edge of the world, matches ancient descriptions of Sami and Norse underworlds. These were places of cold and shadow, realms existing in a state of permanent twilight. Perhaps the most illuminating connection lies in the name itself. Blokula, the Blue Hill, isn't just a reference to the color of the granite on the island of the Blue Maiden. In old mythology, the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki, presided over the realm of the dead. Her physical form was described as being half flesh and half blue, a dual nature reflecting the boundary between the living and departed. Her kingdom was a place of blue and grey shadows, a colour scheme that perfectly reflects the spectral light described by those who claim to have visited the gathering. The transition to Christianity didn't erase these deep-seated beliefs, it merely renamed them. The shamanic traveller was rebranded as a malevolent witch, the spirit world was remapped as a demonic playground, and the ancient goddess of the dead was replaced by the Little Master. This mystical history suggests the Great Noise was, in part, a violent collision between two different ways of understanding consciousness. The Lutheran authorities interpreted the flight to Blokulla as a physical act of treason, a literal movement of the body through air. But for the people of the countryside, whose traditions were still steeped in the survival of the old ways, the flight was something far more fluid and spectral. It was a remnant of the ecstatic trance, a memory of a time when consciousness was free to wander the northern night. The tragedy of the 1670s was that the law couldn't tolerate a soul that moved outside its control. The descriptions of the feast at the gathering also take on new, eerie significance when viewed through the lens of ancient ritual. The banquet of toads and inverted prayers was a dark reflection of the communal feasts of the pre-Christian era. In the Old World, ritual eating was a method of binding the community to the gods and the land. By transforming the gathering feast into something revolting and demonic, the Church was effectively poisoning the cultural memory of those ancient gatherings. Even the biara, or milk hare, has roots in this shamanic past. In the old traditions, a practitioner could create a fetch, or spirit double, to perform tasks at a distance. This was a form of externalized soul power. During the trials, this mystical concept was stripped of its spiritual context and transformed into a malevolent tool of theft. The milk hare was the shamanic spirit helper transformed into a demonic parasite. It's a perfect example of how the Great Noise took fragments of a broken mythology and weaponized them against the very people who still carried those traditions in their bones. When we consider the modern Easter witch, these mystical roots become even more apparent. We see children carrying birch branches and copper kettles, unaware they're handling the symbols of a shamanic heritage. The birch has always been a sacred tree in the north, associated with purification. In the 17th century, these branches were used for flagellation of the flesh, a ritual of suffering. But in the older world, they were used to beat the bounds and drive away the spirits of winter. The modern postgris is a sanitized, feathered survivor of a ritual that once moved between the worlds of the living and dead. The Great Noise wasn't just a legal frenzy, it was a spiritual cleansing, an attempt by the state to finally extinguish the last remnants of northern shamanism. By labeling the soul journey as demonic flight, the authorities were attempting to seal the doorways to the other world forever. They wanted a world that was fixed and literal, where the only path to the divine was through church and crown. But folklore proved more resilient than fire. The old beliefs didn't vanish. They went underground, hiding beneath the surface of the new religion, and eventually re-emerging in the whimsical masks of a spring holiday. As the sun sets on another Maundy Thursday, the boundary between worlds remains as thin as it was in the days of the vulva. The flight to the Blue Hill is still occurring, though we've forgotten how to perceive it. It's there in the way we decorate our homes and the stories we tell our children. We are descendants of a culture that once knew how to fly, and then burned the people who remembered the way. The blue-fleshed goddess of the dead and the shaman on the spirit staff are the silent ancestors of the little girl in the headscarf. When she knocks on your door and asks for candy, she isn't just a child playing a game. She's a spectral messenger from a time before the stake, a living reminder of a history that is both more horrific and more fascinating than we dare to imagine. The Blue Hill is still calling, and the flight to the gathering is a journey that never truly ends. But as the fear of the stake began to fade into the Enlightenment, the terror of Blockula didn't disappear. It evolved. It moved from the courtroom into the streets, taking on a new, rowdy form that would haunt the 19th century with a different kind of darkness. A heavy, wet snow falls over the jagged coast of western Sweden in the middle of the 19th century. Inside a small, isolated farmhouse, an elderly couple sits huddled near the dying embers of the hearth. It's Maundy Thursday, a night that still tastes of iron and old secrets in the mouths of the aged. Suddenly, the silence is shattered. There's a violent, splintering crash as a heavy wooden log is hurled through the window, skidding across the floorboards in a shower of glass and winter chill. Before the old man can reach the door, a chorus of otherworldly shrieks and howls erupts from the darkness, the sound of caterwauling cats, distorted and human, vibrating with malevolent joy. When he finally steps into the night, he finds no demons, only fading footprints of figures in hideous rags and the sharp, lingering smell of soot. On the log lies a scrap of paper, decorated with crude, demonic symbols and a verse inviting him to join the Black Sabbath at the Blue Hill. He trembles as he picks it up. He knows it's the work of village youth, yet in the marrow of his bones, he feels the weight of a history that refuses to stay buried. The mask is being worn again, and the terror it evokes is very, very real. By the early 1800s, the pyres of the Great Noise had been cold for over a century. The legal system had long since abandoned the prosecution of witches, and the Enlightenment had supposedly swept shadows from the Swedish mind. But folklore survival is a persistent, spectral thing. It doesn't vanish, it merely changes shape. In the 19th century, the myth of Blockula underwent a strange and disturbing transformation. It shifted from legal reality into a form of sanctioned rebellion, a dark carnival where youth used the imagery of the witch to mock and terrorize the adult world. This was the era of frightening Easter, a time when the holiday wasn't for toddlers seeking candy, but for young adults seeking to unleash the chaos of the inverted world. In this period, the figure of the Påskkärring, the Easter witch, was something truly hideous to behold. These weren't the sweet, grandmotherly figures seen on modern postcards. These were teenagers, dressed in filthy, oversized rags and tattered shawls, their goal being to appear as unnatural as possible. They wore skråpukansikte, grotesque masks fashioned from stiffened paper or heavy fabric, with eyebrows made of thick forest moss and skin blackened with layers of soot and grease. They were the physical manifestation of the soot-stained travelers who had once been accused of flying through chimneys. This was a time of absolute gender reversal, a lingering echo of the gathering's law of inversion. Young men would dress as ancient, withered hags, while young women transformed themselves into trolls or old men with soot-smudged beards. They moved through villages in roving, unruly bands, their identities hidden behind their hideous masks. They didn't walk. They moved with a liminal, hopping gait, specifically imitating the limp of the devil or the erratic movements of the milk hare. For one night, they were the spectral guests of Easter Eve, and they owned the streets. The oral terror of these groups was a key component of the ritual. As they prowled from house to house, they would emit rhythmic shrieks and caterwauling cries intended to mimic witches' familiars. In the silence of a 19th century rural night, the sound was jarring and invasive. It was the sound of the Great Noise returning as mockery. They would overturn carts in farmyards, release livestock, and pour water over horses to create the impression that the real witches had returned to ride the animals hard through the night. It was a form of ritualized vandalism that forced the community to acknowledge the presence of the eerie. The log-throwing ritual was the most aggressive element of this 19th century tradition. It was a startling act of domestic invasion, approaching a house in silence, then suddenly hurling a log into the living quarters before fleeing. The anonymous Easter letters attached to these logs weren't friendly greeting cards. They were frighteningly personal invitations to join the devil at Blocula, decorated with drawings of pitchforks and verses that mocked the recipient's faith. The letter was a summons from the void, a reminder that they were being watched by darkness. The older generation was genuinely vulnerable to this harassment. Many who had been born in the late 1700s still harbored a residual, ancestral belief in the reality of the gathering. They lived in the shadow of their grandparents' stories of the beheadings at Torsåker. When a hideous, soot-faced figure appeared at their window, the fear they felt wasn't theatrical. It was primal folklore survival. They dared not complain to authorities, fearing that if they insulted the witches, they would suffer genuine misfortune in the coming year. The mockery was powerful, precisely because the original terror had never truly been forgotten. This dark Easter served as a pressure valve for a society that was still deeply religious and hierarchical. By wearing the mask of the witch, the 19th century Swede was reclaiming a history of trauma and turning it into a tool of social power. They were becoming the monsters their ancestors had burned. The transition from this rowdy adult terror to the sanitized childhood tradition we see today only began in the late Victorian era, led by the rising middle class and the influence of popular art. Figures like the artist Jenny Nyström began to produce postcards that reimagined the Easter witch. In Nyström's world, the påskärring was no longer a soot-smeared teenager hurling logs. She was a sweet, smiling grandmother in a colorful scarf, accompanied by a friendly black cat. These mass-produced images were immensely popular and helped to divorce the tradition from its bloody roots. The hideous mask was replaced by the charming face, and the summons to hell became a request for candy. However, the tools of the ritual remained. The copper coffee pot that modern children carry today is a direct descendant of the medicine horn used in the trials. The birch branches, the påskris, have an even darker history. Once used for Good Friday flagellation and 19th century ritualized aggression, they are now decorated with soft feathers. We have taken the things that once terrified us, the flight to the gathering, the demonic familiar, the medicine horn, and we have handed them to our children as toys. We transform the massacre into a parade, but for the historian, the mask of the 19th century is a reminder that the great noise never truly ended. It just changed its volume. The mockery of the 1800s was a bridge between the blood of the 1670s and the candy of the 2000s. It was a time when the world was still half dark, when the boundary between a prank and a curse was still dangerously thin. As the 20th century approached, the great noise was pushed further into the realm of whimsical folklore, and the Blue Maiden Island became a national park rather than a place of dread. But the inversion remains. We still celebrate the rebirth of spring by dressing as the figures of death and judgment. We still mark the holy day with the symbols of the unholy. As we move into the final part of our journey, we must look at the modern mask and the final revelation of the gathering. Keep the image of the soot-blackened youth in your mind. The transition from the hideous to the charming is perhaps the most frightening transformation of all. It is the moment a society decides to forget the blood and replace it with a whimsical lie. But the truth is still there, hidden in the copper pot and the birch branches. The gathering is not a story for children, it is a record of a legal massacre. And as the modern Easter morning dawns, the shadow of the Blue Maiden still falls across the land, a cold blue reminder that the past is never truly gone. It is just wearing a different mask. The great noise never truly ended. It just changed its volume. It became the whisper of wind through the birch branches, the clink of a coin in a copper pot, and the secret names we are still afraid to speak. The sanitization of the 20th century was a social necessity, a way for a nation to move past a tragedy that claimed approximately 400 lives. But in our rush to forget, We have lost the mystical wisdom of the old world. We have replaced the shamanic flight with a walk to the neighbor's door. We have replaced the blue hill with a holiday card. The tradition of the Easter witch is not a celebration of folklore. It is a ritual of forgetting. By dressing our children as the very thing we once burned, we are performing a mass psychological exorcism every single year. We are saying to the ghosts of 1675, "Look, you are no longer a threat. You are a child. You are a toy." We have conquered the little master not through prayer, but through mockery and sweets. The great noise has been transformed into the sweet exchange, a victory of the mundane over the spectral. But the blue hill is still there, rising from the mist of the Kalmar Strait. It is a place of 9,000 years of ritual, of shamanic flight and demonic feast. It is a place where the world once turned upside down, and it is a place that still demands the return of its stones. The Swedish Easter is a season of light, but that light is cast by the embers of the pyres. When you see the little witches on the street this year, remember the medicine horn and the great noise. Remember that the charming mask they wear is the only thing standing between us and the fire. The gathering is over, but the Blue Maiden is still waiting. The final revelation of Blåkulla is that the eerie and the mystical are not things that belong to the past. They are permanent features of our landscape, the blue granite of our soul. We may paint our cheeks and carry our copper pots, but we are still the travelers of the liminal space. The flight to the gathering is a journey into the heart of what it means to be human. The desire to fly, the fear of darkness, and the desperate need to belong to something greater than ourselves. The great noise was a tragedy, but it was also a moment of absolute clarity. It was a time when the world was wide open, and the Blue Hill was just across the water. Easter in Sweden will always be a time of the backwards world, a time when we let the monsters into our homes and give them candy. It is a folklore survival that connects the modern suburbs to the iron-grey winds of the 17th century. The sanitized mask is the price we pay for our peace. But as the sun sets on another Easter Eve, the shadow of the Blue Maiden still falls across the land, a cold blue reminder that the past is never truly gone. It is just waiting for the next time the world turns upside down and the flight to the gathering begins again. The geography of the damned is still mapped in the marrow of our bones. The ritual of the gathering is still encoded in our decorations. And the great noise is still there, just beneath the surface of the whimsical Easter morning. We are the children of the Blue Hill, and the flight to Blåkulla is a journey that defines us, whether we remember the name or not. The nation has successfully buried its ghosts, turning a period of unimaginable violence into a season of childhood joy. But the island knows. The stones remember. And every year, packages arrive at the ferry dock, returned by tourists who took something they shouldn't have, desperate to lift a curse that follows them across oceans and decades. For in the end, the Easter witches are not them. They are us. And the gathering is now.